Hello and welcome back to what is already the final part of this Jubilee conference of Jason Institute. I'm here again joined by all my little thematic bricks and bracks and nicks and necks, and even Peter the Penguin is back because we're almost to an end. All good things come to an end, but not before we listen to former Secretary General of NATO Jaap de Hoop Scheffer. Again, like all the previous times, there is plenty of time for Q&A afterwards. So please, first of all, enjoy his speech and reserve your questions for later.
President Trump has left the White House. The United States President, with whom we Europeans had fundamental differences, who was without realizing also a motor, a stimulus for European integration, who was rejoicing the end of Pax Americana, is now in Mar-a-Lago, improving his golf handicap, and who knows, preparing for more political activity. Joe Biden, eyes wide open, decent, soft-spoken, but tough when need be. An old and experienced hand in international relations has hit the ground running. COVID-19 recovery, an economic crisis, an infrastructure crisis, racial tensions, a Herculean internal agenda. And my question is, will he restart the transatlantic relationship where we left it after 8 years President Obama? Will he start it? Will we do it? Should we do it? The answer to my own question is that I think that we would make a serious mistake if we would try to bring back a world which does not exist anymore and will not come to exist in the future. The post-World War II Pax Americana, with which my and the generation of my children grew up, has, I think, come to an end for two reasons. First of all, a second superpower, China, has entered the scene. And secondly, the Americans themselves have lost the appetite to be the security provider, the world policeman, as they were in Vietnam, as they were in Iraq, as they were in Afghanistan, the Western Balkans, and what have you. And in my short speech, I would like to address these two factors, starting with China, the disruptor-in-chief of as I said, Western-oriented world order, which dates back to the Second World War. President Xi Jinping, with unprecedented power since Mao Zedong, in power as long as he wishes, this President Xi Jinping has one overriding ambition. In 2049, the celebration of 100 years Chinese Communist Party, CCP, China must, in the Xi Jinping doctrine, China must be the center of power and civilization of the world. The Middle Kingdom, as it was for centuries. And 2049 marks another important occasion in Chinese history. It ended what the Chinese used to call the century of humiliation, during which China lost 2 opium wars. The so-called Boxer Uprising was crushed, and last but not least, the Japanese War. And President Xi Jinping wants to rebuild a dynasty, and within that dynasty are, of course, Hong Kong, is Taiwan, and are also the Eastern and South China Seas. And what is special in China, the CCP, the Communist Party, the state, the law, and President Xi Jinping are one, completely merged into each other. And that is, I think, why we have in the West difficulties to grasp Chinese civilization, because of this merger of all those elements which in normal democracies in other states are separated, of course separated. And with a combination of soft power Think about Confucius Institutes. Think about sending students abroad. Think about the Belt and Road Initiative, which has an important soft power element in it. With a combination of soft power, but also hard power when need be. Think about taking innocent Canadian citizens hostage. Think about bullying Australia. Think about strangling democracy in Hong Kong. And last but not least, think about extremely serious violation of the rights of 1 million Uyghurs, leading at least to crimes against humanity, and in the reading of American Secretary of State Tony Blinken, genocide. And last but not least, as I mentioned, claiming absolute sovereignty over the South and East China Seas in blatant contravention of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, UNCLOS. China, in other words, is challenging us. And with us, I mean the vested superpower, the United States of America, and the West more in general. And when I mention the West, I do not exclusively mean us here in Europe, as US allies, as European Union members. With us, I mean the world's major democracies. Australia, as much as Japan. South Korea, yes, even India. China's regional rival, which finds it more and more difficult to be non-aligned in the modern sense of the word. And China, as you know, has usually been sitting on the fence in these very difficult political questions. Not for nothing, by the way, the Americans speak about an Indo-Pacific strategy, and we here in Europe, is my opinion, we tend to forget India, to include India in the equation, and in my equation, India plays a very important part. I'm less interested, when we talk about China, in qualifications like what China is, a systemic rival, according to the European Union, an antagonist, a competitor, a new Cold War enemy, or whatever label you want to glue on it. I have not much with these qualifications because they do not provide us a political answer to the fundamental questions we are faced with. But one thing is for certain. This new superpower China will challenge the vested superpower United States of America, and that is a major challenge. A challenge on trade, a challenge on tech, a challenge on artificial intelligence, a challenge on data protection, and you can go on in adding to this list. But also a confrontation with real risks in the military and in the political domain. Think about Taiwan. Think about the East and South China Seas. If you want to read a book on what a confrontation between superpowers might mean, read Professor Graham Allison's book, Destined for War. Graham Allison is a Harvard professor emeritus, and he has, through history, identified, I think, 16 scenarios where a vested superpower was challenged by an upcoming superpower. And in most of those scenarios, it led to conflict and even to war. Now, I'm not predicting war here in the Grote Kerk in The Hague, celebrating 45 years of Jason. But it is a very challenging, if not in some elements, dangerous confrontation. Remember my second argument, on which I based the end of the present Pax Americana as we know it. And that's about the Americans themselves. And I think President Trump was not the initiator, but rather a symptom of the United States not turning its back to the world, but more clearly and more sharply trying to define the United States' interests in answering the question, do we act or don't we act? And I think President Donald J. Trump read the mood of the nation correctly in this regard. Do not forget that in 2014, when we had the Libya crisis, then President Obama already spoke about we will lead from behind. And we, of course, were the United States of America. In other words, protecting United States interests not in the transatlantic relationship, but also in Asia and the Pacific, was also a priority for President Obama. President Obama qualified himself already more than 4 years, more than 5, more than 6 years ago as a Pacific president. I, in my long career, had never heard an American president qualifying himself as a Pacific president. And my point is that under President Joe Biden, this will not change. And I give you an example, a personal example, based on my contacts with President Biden when he was vice president under President Obama during my final year as NATO Secretary General. When then the discussion was with President Obama, should we have a troop surge in Afghanistan? President Biden said, no, we should not have a troop surge. It came about, as you know. We can do with a relatively small counter-terrorist force in Afghanistan. So Joe Biden was then already defining the interest of the United States in a different way. And I have no reason to believe that he will go the other way now. By the way, when I combine this internal United States argument with China, there is everything where Republicans and Democrats are divided politically in the United States of America, not on China, not on China. And I'll come back to it later because I expect a very tough, bipartisan supported line of Joe Biden and his administration on China. The Uyghurs and the genocide is one first example. Now, dear Jason friends, what does this analysis mean for us? US allies in NATO, members of the European Union, all heavily involved with and in China. Be it on trade, be it on tech, be it on rare earth, be it on all the elements I tried to mention before. What does it mean for NATO? For NATO, I think it means that China should feature prominently on the agenda of a more political NATO. NATO is a political military alliance in that order. And NATO would never survive as a military alliance only. So what NATO should do, it should, in accordance, by the way, with the recommendations by the so-called Reflection Group, which reported to Secretary General Stoltenberg not that long ago, NATO should discuss all elements of the Allies' security interests vis-à-vis China. In more simple terms, NATO should have and develop a China policy. Not to send NATO flotillas of naval ships to the South and East China Seas immediately, but in the political realm, given China's position, given China's attitude as a superpower, NATO should develop a China policy. And as far as the European NATO allies are concerned, they must also realize that in this debate and under present circumstances, Europe is not the first and foremost United States foreign policy imperative. China is. And to avoid misunderstanding, ladies and gentlemen, I have not a shimmer of a doubt that the United States will come to the assistance of European allies in an Article 5 scenario. President Trump, by the way, never formally endorsed Article 5, but I have not a shimmer of a doubt that the Article 5, the core of the NATO treaty, stands fully upright in the vision of the Biden administration. But, here comes a big but, President Joe Biden will ask his NATO allies a question which might bring them, us in other words, out of our comfort zone. And that question goes as follows. Dear European allies, dear friends, we are in a partnership together in a globalized, complex and unpredictable world. Dear friends, what is your weight in this partnership? Are we jointly going to be a counterweight to superpower China? Joe Biden will probably say containing China, but I keep it to a counterweight to China. Are we going to do that together? Or are we each going our own way? And he will, of course, also repeat in more diplomatic terms the question to the European allies. Could you finally leave your seat on the beach with your pina colada and take your own defense spending seriously. Again, he'll say that in more diplomatic terms, but I consider it no less than a shame, and that includes very much my own country, the Netherlands, a shame and nothing less, what we have seen in not honoring financial commitments undertaken in 2014. For the European Union, the Biden question I just referred to is also a rather uncomfortable one. It will not only land on the NATO desks in Brussels, but also very much on the EU desks in Brussels, on the other side of Brussels, and in the national capitals of the European Union and Europe more in general. There it might be even more complicated to answer the question, because if you take the relationship between the United States and the European Union, all the interests definitely not run parallel to each other. Think about digital taxation of the big tech platforms. Think about trade. Think about a carbon border tax. Think about the comprehensive agreement on investment, the CAI, which was concluded with China at the end of last year. Not very easy questions. Interests not definitely running parallel. But on the other hand, very important questions. Last but not least, of course, I should mention here again human rights, the Uyghurs, the strangling of democracy in Hong Kong, Tibet, the Falun Gong. You could go on. And there I must conclude that, like NATO, the European Union does not have a consistent China policy. And on the basis of Biden's question I just referred to, the European Union must have a China policy. I could, in the sidelines, in the margins, mention another major bone of contention between the United States and Europe, and that is Nord Stream 2, the second gas pipeline running directly from Russia into Germany. In other words, uncomfortable questions which will have to be answered. And the answer in Europe, which will be given, I hope, will to a large extent depend on the outcome of the German elections later this year, and the French presidential elections during the French EU presidency, by the way, next year, May. And I mention, of course, France and Germany, because I'm of the opinion that when we look for European leadership, it is France and Germany which should join hands. And without France and Germany leading and joining hands, I'm afraid that real leadership in Europe could be cast into doubt. So, Europe, the European Union, but not exclusively the European Union, Europe will have to develop its own responsibility where it comes to its military posture. And that includes, in my opinion, a capability in Europe, because it will not exclusively be European Union. You need Great Britain there as well, and other non-EU members non-NATO members like Norway, non-EU members like Norway, I should say. Because in Europe we cannot simply always ring the bell of the White House and the Oval Office when there is a crisis. So that's the situation, ladies and gentlemen. In a situation where the world does not organize itself. The world has never organized itself, and the world will not organize itself in the 21st century. And we have been a bit we have grown a bit addicted to US leadership. The US was always the nation who oversaw. The US organized. The US led us, even when we had major differences of opinion. And I already mentioned Vietnam and I mentioned Iraq. And the US, I add, has always been a force for good over the decades. And the fundamental question, but I have no time to dwell on it this afternoon any longer, is, in my opinion, if the United States can afford to be reticent to act on the world scene. But that's perhaps for a second lustrum and a festive party of Jason. And let me add that, in my opinion, the United States of America will always be our first point of reference. It provides the ultimate nuclear guarantee. It shares our values. So what I hear in Europe from time to time, and what I see in opinion polls for the European Council of Foreign Relations, there can never be, in my opinion, there can never be any equidistance in our policies vis-à-vis the United States of America and China. Let's never forget that. I spoke about Chinese civilization. I spoke about human rights. And a high Chinese party official on several occasions has tried to sell to me the idea that their concept of human rights was much superior to ours. That is not acceptable. And there we have to defend ourselves. And we'll do that with the United States of America together. So this is, in my opinion, the backbone of the transatlantic bond. But I add, showing that I'm an Atlanticist by birth and nature, but also a convinced European, if there ever was a moment on the basis of my scenario, or on the basis of other scenarios, if there ever was a moment for the European Union to take itself seriously, show self-confidence, realize that it is a financial economic superpower as well. Unfortunately, it is a political adolescent and a military midget, but it is a financial economic giant, a superpower, that also Europe learns to take its own responsibility. And that also in Europe, and also in a country like the Netherlands, there's nothing wrong with being an Atlanticist and being a European. But let's conclude, and that's after all the title of my short speech this afternoon. We're living in a world where the autopilots definitely will have to be switched off. We have flown on autopilot for a long time, for decades. We cannot afford to do that any longer. We should be inventive and we should have self-confidence. As Jason has shown to have self-confidence over the past 45 years of its existence, with which I again congratulate her wholeheartedly. Thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you very much, Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, for this very comprehensive speech. We have been talking, well, almost all day about comprehensive approach, but Mr. Scheffer has taken a very comprehensive approach indeed to his speech, ranging from Vietnam to the Opium Wars, from NATO to political party level decision making, and even setting our agenda for the next lustrum. Welcome. Please join us here in the chair. I could ask you a million questions, but I won't do it. I will leave it to the viewers here because the questions really have been pouring in since the beginning. So I would like to give the viewers at home, who are mostly students and young professionals working in the field of international security, to give them more the floor and make it an interactive sort of Q&A session, even though it's digitally. The first question is a very interesting one. During the Trump administration, which you kicked off your speech with, it was not only Trump, but also within the European partners of NATO. There were some internal struggles since Macron, among others, called NATO brain dead. Did you share his opinion at that time? And do you think that with Biden now in the White House, it has risen from the dead? Or are there still steps that need to be taken?
I'm a Macronite in the sense that I'm a Francophile, a Francophone. Not because my wife is a French teacher, but also because NATO is bilingual, and NATO you have as a Secretary General to speak both English and French. But I fundamentally disagreed with him. He made it worse. He did not only say NATO is brain dead, he questioned Article 5. And in my opinion, a leader like Macron should never publicly share doubts about Article 5. That is the backbone, and only doing that is already quite dangerous. I say I'm a Macronite because when you look at Europe and the European future, you can't blame Macron of having ideas about Europe's future. But Biden is of a different category than his predecessor. Well, that's easy. Biden is one of the oldest hands in US foreign policy. I mean, Joe Biden knows everything. Knows NATO until its smallest veins. And is committed to NATO, without any doubt. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, was Vice President Joe Biden's foreign policy advisor, traveled with President Biden, is also a very old hand. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. I have the fullest confidence in the team which is now in the White House.
Well, speaking that, there are some other questions, of course, not only about the external threats, because in your speech you had a lot of attention for external threats. And Nikita was wondering, NATO also faces some internal threats as well, considering, for instance, the membership of Turkey, of the more troublesome relations. This was actually during the same period as the speech or the saying of Macron that NATO was brain dead. It was around the same time we had some troubles with Turkey. So how did Turkey behave during your days as a Secretary General, and how would you handle its current behavior when you were still in this position?
Turkey is a complicated country. And I'll explain why I say complicated. Turkey is where it is. One should never underestimate, geography matters a lot in international relations. If Turkey would not be geographically where it is, we would be much more tough vis-à-vis Turkey. But everybody knows of the audience Turkish geographical position, the Brits to Central Asia, the Middle East, and what have you. That limits the marge de manœuvre, to use a French expression, diplomatic marge de manœuvre, margins we have politically, to tell Turkey what we really would like to tell Turkey. And that's, of course, we have seen that under President Erdogan over the past years. We've seen that in him buying S-400 missiles from Vladimir Putin, which is, in my view, unacceptable. There's no other word for it. Turkish democracy is under pressure. Look at how many journalists are behind bars in Turkey. Here comes the but. Two buts. The one but is Turkey should be inside NATO and not out. Turkey is a very important ally with a very strong military. On the EU side is the big but with the capital B. We have, like it or not, a migration agreement with Turkey, and the European Union has only been able to solve its migration problems. We all remember the thousands marching along the German motorways and elsewhere in Europe. Yeah, thanks to an agreement with Turkey, in which the European Union spends a lot of money, but Erdogan has more or less closed the flow of migrants down that route. So, in other words, I think we should criticize Turkey and not keep our mouth shut in not at all criticizing. But I'm a realist. I've become more realistic than I was 20, 30, 40 years ago. That has to do with age, without any doubt as well. Turkey is complicated. Turkey is difficult. Turkey, by the way, has an excellent corps diplomatique. Turkish diplomats are usually triple A1. But Turkey, Erdogan knows very well that he has a lot of margin. Lately, over the past 2-3 weeks, we have seen the atmosphere becoming a bit better. On the other hand, he is not very friendly, to put it mildly, to the Kurdish party. Complicated, difficult, but difficult to manage and difficult to handle because it is where it is.
Yeah.
And for some people will find my answer too realistic, but I think there's no alternative.
No, I think it's true, actually, and the same goes for Ukraine still being a partner. It also has to do with the position. What's really interesting as well, and also sort of related to Turkey, is, well, a lot of people missed out on Russia in your speech. There were some questions on Russia as well. There was one question from Casper, and he asked, well, as you know, in 2007, Russia, of course, had the cyber attacks in Estonia. What is the cyber attack threshold in order to invoke NATO's Article 5? I mean, is it always bound to the territory? Like Niels Woudstra also said in his contribution, maybe NATO should step out of the idea of just solely protecting physical territory.
I think NATO has discussed and NATO has concluded that the cyber domain is relevant for the discussions, potential discussions on Article 5. My answer to your question would be, for me, the incentive would be a nation or nations under cyber pressure would invoke Article 4. When a nation is seriously asking for Article 4, for serious political consultations because it thinks its security is in danger, then I would not exclude a debate on Article 5 along the lines you mentioned in your question. But I say again, NATO officials will and should never, neither heads of states and government, should never in public, I mean, would a real NATO Secretary General sit here, he would be very, very careful and very reticent, much more reticent than I am, by publicly telling what would be Article 5 and what would not be Article 5. The Allies would decide on the spot, by the way, in the North Atlantic Council. NATO is in that regard a very flexible alliance that on the spot, imagine an attack, imagine that I'm Secretary General, I would immediately convene, and Stoltenberg would do the same. An emergency meeting of the North Atlantic Council, the level of ambassadors, but you can very quickly go up to the level of foreign defense ministers. You can also, certainly in these Zoom times, you can have the heads of states and government on a screen within the hour. But cyber is, in my opinion, definitely a threat which is on a par with other more classical threats we know, depending on, of course, how serious and how heavy it is.
Of course, yeah, there's some margin and some wiggle room there.
There's always margin. Ukraine you mentioned. Let me briefly mention Ukraine. We should never forget that Ukraine is the cradle of the Russian Orthodox Church, because the Ukrainian ruler, it was then not called Ukraine, it was called Kiev and Rus, Kiev. Ukrainian ruler in 918 after Christ, if my facts are correct, converted to Christianity. And that's where the Christian Orthodox Church started. And if you know Putin and see how Putin used the Russian Orthodox Church as a foreign policy tool, realizing that that church started in Kiev, you can imagine that Ukraine and NATO, for Putin and for the Russians, and I'm going to put it very mildly now, is not an easy topic and not an easy subject. And do also not forget that in 2008, when NATO had a big fight, it was during my mandate, had a big fight between President George Bush on the other hand and Sarkozy and Merkel, French Germany on the other hand. And that NATO issued a communique, they, Ukraine and Georgia, will become NATO members. I'm quoting now from the communique. And that was a red line for Putin. And in August of the same year, he invaded Georgia. And a few years ago, he invaded Crimea. In other words, Ukraine, the easy answer I could give to a question on Ukraine is yes, of course Ukraine can become NATO member. Of course Ukraine can have NATO membership action plan, the so-called MAP. But I'm afraid it is not as easy as it sounds. And when you listen carefully to Jens Stoltenberg, this is more or less in much more diplomatic terms than what I do now, what he says.
Yeah, it's the sensitivities of the periphery, basically, whether it's
normal
NATO
sensitivities.
Or the EU.
Having said that, it is of course unacceptable what's happening in Luhansk and Donetsk. And Russian troop movements are clearly, Putin, in my opinion, is clearly giving a signal to Biden. Biden is much tougher on Russia, but that's easy, than Donald J. Trump. But very much supportive of Ukraine. So we'll see where this discussion will go.
Yeah. The next question is on, well, part of European, I would say, how feasible, is a question by Stein, thank you for asking this question. How feasible would the idea of a European army be against the potential Chinese military threat? I assume with European army he would mean an EU army for now, rather than the European member states of NATO. Just the purpose of discussion. So how feasible would that be?
Well, I think we should this afternoon, after 45 years of Jason, we should strike the notion European army, because in my opinion it's a misnomer. Why is it a misnomer? Can you ever imagine? Rhetorical question is following now. Can you ever imagine that a national parliament? Let's take the Netherlands, that the Tweede Kamer der Staten-Generaal, the Dutch National Parliament, would cede authority to send our young men and women into harm's way to another institution, the European Parliament, other government leaders. No question about it. I've been in Parliament for 16 years, and there's one element I would never ever give up, and that is, as a national parliamentarian, have the final decision. Are we going in or aren't we going in? And a European army, and that's why I call it a misnomer, and you already give an indication, is that EU, is that Europe? In my opinion, it is Europe. because after Brexit, there's nothing much left when you talk about military capabilities, and the EU is France, basically, and Germany will, for reasons we understand, never be in the lead when it concerns military operations, and the Bundeswehr is not in the best possible state. I'm putting it very mildly now. Like the Dutch armed forces, by the way, but I qualify this as a shame already, so I'll not do that again. But here comes the but. I don't link this discussion to China, because I cannot see Europe militarily defending itself against China. I don't see China invading Europe. And for the major scenarios, of course, we have NATO. What I do see, and that's a good idea by Emmanuel Macron, that is that the bilateral cooperation will be intensified, will be strengthened. The Dutch have a very close relationship in a brigade with the German army. There is close cooperation with the Royal Marines in Great Britain, with the Belgians, Air Force, Navy. We might see that at a certain stage with the French as well, depending on what kind of submarines, new submarines the Netherlands are going to order. I don't know, and it's too early to say. In other words, bilateral cooperation, yes. And an idea which we have launched as Advisory Council on International Affairs in this country, I have the privilege to chair that council, is that it would be a good idea, given the fact that when you have a major crisis, the question would come up, who will act? Will it be NATO? Will it be the European Union? Will it be an ad hoc coalition of the willing? That we organize a very informal European Security Council with 3 permanent members, the French, the Germans and the Brits, the 3 big ones, headed by the Secretary General of NATO and the President of the European Council. Then you have the EU formally and you have NATO formally engaged. There is a major crisis. Those 5 get together, informally, no formal organization, no new institution, informally. They discuss the crisis and they are going to invite nations which are relevant for the crisis, regional or otherwise. They invite nations to join them and they come and they try to come to a decision. Who is going to act? The EU, Europe, a coalition of the willing. Is it NATO? Depends on the Americans, of course. If it is, in other words, it's complex. But I stick to my point I made in my speech a moment ago, that Europe, not necessarily only the European Union, should have its act together militarily. And let's not make ourselves illusions. Strategic autonomy. The United States of America provides the ultimate nuclear guarantee. Strategic autonomy, are we going it alone? Can we go it alone as Europeans? No question. We couldn't go it alone in Libya, and we certainly cannot go it alone in any major crisis, let alone the unthinkable nuclear crisis. So let's forget that, and let's be pragmatic when we discuss defense and Europe.
And they're interesting because you call yourself, well, a realist. I would say you see a lot of, especially in the field of international relations, this debate coming up of a more comprehensive approach, cross-border solutions, European army, more cooperation. Yeah. But as you mentioned, I think rightfully so, still it's structured around nation states. The political link, the political mandate, of course, are really clearly set in the Houses of Parliament. So do you see a friction here for the future?
No, I don't, but that I give you the answer I don't might be the result. I'm not a European federalist. I'm a convinced European, but I don't see a European federation. And if there's one element of democratic legitimacy, it's sending your young men and women into harm's way. I mean, I mentioned that already. Yes, NATO certainly, of course, is an intergovernmental organization. In NATO, the nation states decide. European Union is a different animal. There is the transfer of sovereignty, of course, the order of the day. In certain elements that can be increased, in my opinion, but not in the first place in the military domain. Close bilateral cooperation, trilateral cooperation, coalitions of the willing. It is happening at the moment, not enough, in my opinion. But certainly not go for European armies and what have you. But let me give you one scenario. I didn't have the time to mention it from the rostrum. Imagine a major crisis in the Sahel. And you discussed Africa with General Middendorp this morning. Niger, Mali, Chad, we know what the Sahel is. In the Sahel you have climate change. In Africa, people are going on the move because parts of Africa become uninhabitable. Africa adds, as we know, 1 billion people between now and 2050. You might have discussed it this morning. Climate change, terrorism, from Boko Haram in northern Nigeria and Burkina Faso, to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or whatever it's called, to ISIL, which is building up camp, setting up camp in that region, an ungoverned region. Imagine that you have a very serious situation where all these elements come together and where we would be confronted with mass migration. And that it would be necessary not to go in with only soft power, but with hard power. The French are now in Mali with hard power, I can tell you, and they have the greatest difficulties in their Operation Barkhane, as it is called. Can you then, in such a scenario, go to President Biden or to the Americans and say, excuse us, Mr. President, we have a crisis in the Sahel, which is basically our southern border. Europe's southern border is, in my opinion, not the Mediterranean, but is the Sahel. Could you please help us out? Go back to the Western Balkans in the 90s. The UN was unsuccessful. Europe was unsuccessful. It took Srebrenica, always difficult to pronounce that word and to mention that name for a Dutchman, certainly a Dutch politician as I, who was then a member of parliament. Srebrenica was needed to convince Bill Clinton, against his wish, to go in, let NATO in, and then within a few months the war ended.
Yeah, it was supposed to be Europe's finest hour, I think.
Well, it was not. And to be quite honest, Libya wasn't either, because the European allies couldn't manage Libya on their own without the US.
Yeah, exactly. We have, I think, 2 more questions. I hope we have the time, at least for one question. This from Nigel, and he's wondering, well, you merely focus on the threat of China, but is there a scenario imaginable in which China keeps on increasing its power, but we, and with we he means the EU and the US, as the other main global powers will coexist peacefully? What is necessary, if so, in this regard?
I hope that we can coexist peacefully. I mentioned the Graham Allison book, Destined for War, which is, if you feel a depression coming up, you shouldn't read that book. But anyway, of course we should, of course, strive to coexist peacefully. Which will not be easy, given the fact that it's for us a very complex civilization. Russia was mentioned, not in my speech, but the Russian civilization, I should say the civilization during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, was in a very perverted, derailed way our civilization. Christian civilization, for a large part, not totally, of course, because there are many Muslims in, but it was our civilization. China civilization bears no relationship with what you and I grew up with. And that is why a Chinese interlocutor can tell me our concept of human rights is far superior to yours. My goodness, with 1 million Uyghurs, with rape and torture. So yes, we should of course strive to coexist. We have no option then to coexist with China, by the way, because it is an ever powerful superpower. But what we cannot accept, in my view, for instance, is that China will block freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, where you have a huge amount of world commercial shipping passing through. But let me finish on a very complicated topic. What if I used to play role play with my students? What if Xi Jinping occupies a small island, not Taiwan itself, but a small island close to Taiwan? China is now permanently violating Taiwanese airspace. The Americans have not a formal, but many informal security guarantees. The going will get tough. So I'm of the opinion that you cannot put 1.4 billion Chinese behind defense. That is impossible. China is a superpower. China is a nuclear power. We have to coexist. And how do we match what I just said with crimes against humanity against the Uyghurs is an awfully difficult question, for which I must admit I have no direct answer. Thank heavens it's not a talk show, because they don't they don't accept that you don't have an answer. But I don't have a
Here,
direct
it's okay.
answer.
It's okay.
Thank you very much.
Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time. We still have a lot of questions, but we had to really draw this to an end. Thank you so much for
Pleasure.
also taking the time, especially to answer all the questions that we got from your speech. So thank you again. I would like to thank all the speakers, the other speakers, the panelists, most of you, all viewers, who provided us with very interesting questions and not only food for thought, but also food for debate and discussion. Of course, I was wondering if you're still interested. There is a special Jason magazine. If you send an email to the organization, they will make sure you get one at home. So congratulations for my part to the Jason Institute and the organization of this wonderful event. I think everyone had a great time. Well, at least here in the church we did. We hope you at home had a great time as well. There's a special thanks I would like to give to the members of the advisory board, and also especially Dr. Minks, Mr. Hekkens, Mr. Woudstra, Mrs. de Ridder, Dr. Ladik, Mr. van der Horst, Mr. Rauw, Dr. Hofstee, Dr. Bergema, and Mr. Aerts of the general board for all their advice and making sure we could have this event. I hope I haven't forgot anybody. So thank you again for joining us in this Jubilee event, and hope to see you maybe next year, or at least in 5 years.